Anything that can be used to tell the story of a people or a group of people. So we're talking about statues, we're talking about plaques, we're talking about visual representations such as murals or other of such artifacts.
When you walk the streets of Buffalo's East Side, and maybe it's the same on the West Side, I don't know that community as well, but it's not unusual where you will pass a tree or a light post, and people would have created a monument to someone who died. You'll see artifacts, sometimes a picture of that person, and other types of things, but in their own way, they are symbolic of that particular place. A monument could be a building that is being preserved because of its historical purpose and significance. You know, right now there's a battle going on to save Bullock Park housing projects. And Bullock Park is not meant to just be a building any more than the Frank Lloyd Wright house. It's just a house. It's you can call it what you want to, but at the end of the day, I would describe it as a monument to the bourgeoisie and to everything that they stood for. That's a part of that. And people have spent over, as a friend of mine loves to say, over $30 million for a house that no one will ever live in. And so it's a monument to that. And so Willard Park becomes a monument, if we can save it, to the battle and fight of African Americans for decent housing.
A conventional definition of a monument is a figure in space that has a memorial plaque that starts to write a history of that individual or event. But what about battlefields as monuments? Empty, relatively empty spaces in which violent acts, aggressive acts, war-like acts have taken place, and that we counter those memories with a certain kind of emptiness by making a monument or a monumental space, as it were.
I feel like I want to make a Venn diagram. I think public art is really meant to be anything that is meant for eyes, for the public, right? It could slip into the monument or the memorial at times, but sometimes I think that monuments and memorials don't necessarily make the best public art. I think I have a lot of like opinions and tastes around that. The monument, I think, perhaps culturally has a little more permanence than a memorial. I think that it tends to be the most kind of wielded by the state compared to public art memorials. It's tend to hold like a didactic or a system of power that it's trying to instruct. And it's kind of a tribute to some idea or politic or person or history, I guess, or future. And then memorials, I feel like, have a flexibility around them, and monuments and memorials have an overlap, of course. I feel like memorials can also be really temporary. Obviously, memorials are, rooted in memory. So it's maybe more about not forgetting someone or something.
That's often a declaration of permanence and authority tied to monument. There's also often a kind of the spectacle material weight tied to them. I think about often that they are choosing a specific moment in history. So there's often a singular perspective, and that perspective is supposed to stand in for the universal, which we know is false, or there's always a single supporting narrative. Well, when I think about memorials, even though there is this overlap, I do tend to think about there being more intimacy. It could be more personal or a collective remembering. I think of them as being tied more to empathy and commemoration, but my whole idea when I think about monuments is how to make monuments in a way act more like memorials, where there's sites that we imbue with our power. It's a site of gathering. It's a site of empathy more than anything else. So how can we kind of make the monument less about its public persona and be more about humanity, or about our humanness?
Public art, monuments, memorials have distinct histories, but I'm actually interested in the ways that they converge, and ultimately the kinds of relationships that bring together the past, the present, and the future at each of these sites. There are, of course, monuments that are dedicated with an idea of presenting and projecting forward the values and visions and ideals of a society. But I always am looking for the ways that grief and loss and trauma are explicitly or implicitly built into monumental sites. Because so much of the kind of will of public memory and public rhetoric, it is ultimately about how to balance loss with a sense of hope or purpose for moving forward. There are many memorials that are spaces of grief, of collection, and that could be for an individual, family, or community, or for a city or a nation. But of course, amidst those sites to grieve are ways and clues and indications of the kind of values and lessons to project forward. And then finally, public art. I think of public art as not just art outside, but art that really is connected to the other realms of public action, public health, public speech, public education. All of that to say, when we perceive a monument, a memorial, or a piece of public art, there might be, and there are fine-grained distinctions, but we don't separate that in our own kind of perception. We meet installations, artwork, murals, markers in public in a very similar way, which is, what's our relationship to it? How does it serve as a portal or as a gateway to the past?
I'm thinking about those monuments that might be very fleeting, like there's one down in Bosque Redondo or Fort Sumner, and it's not a formal monument or memorial, but for me, it's an incredibly powerful one. So for those who don't know the history of Fort Sumner and Bosque Redondo, it's the end point of what's called the Navajo Long Walk, but although Apache and Ute people were also part of this, where Kit Carson was charged by the government to round up all Navajo people that he could find and forcibly move them to a point in what is now southern New Mexico. Many people died in the process. They say that women who were heavily pregnant were simply shot. Elders and babies didn't survive that walk. And when they got there, the water was not clean. They were also placed with people who had been for hundreds, if not more years, their enemies, in fact. They had poor food. They had no means of supporting themselves. And what people have done in the time since, because that is now a kind of, it's considered a monument. The building itself, there's a kind of center there, an information center, but people simply brought stones from where they were displaced from and brought those stones back to Fort Sumner as a way of marking that journey. And for me, that kind of informal monument is in fact much more powerful than any other because it has this deep investment in it.
Kind of have to upend our assumptions of how they've existed. We've almost allowed them to be this singular monolithic entity. I feel as though they should be temporary, they should be ephemeral, they should be engaged with some sort of temporal. I don't know if it makes sense for anything in terms of public art, monument, memorial. I don't know if permanence, physical permanence is critical. I did a project years ago where I did these photographs on billboards, and to me that was like a temporary monument. So what does it mean to kind of recognize the everyday moment? So I'm all about like, how do we upend like scale, longevity, sight? I mean, the show, Everything That's Alive Moves, I felt as though each of those works were monuments, and I was interested in what does it mean to take them out of those sites, outside of the public? Because I think about there are different kinds of publics. Publics could exist it could be a public of one or two, it could be a public indoors. Anytime we gather, in a way you're creating a public.
Monuments are products of their time, meaning that one, they were made at a certain point in time, but two, the social contexts around them change, as we well know. That's why oftentimes it seems that certain monuments, whether they're in the case of, the last number of years, Confederate monuments, or even ones here in the Southwest that are, you could say, colonial monuments to conquistadors, can appear to be inert for a long period of time until the social situation around them changes to the point where the remembering, or to create a memorial to the violence of the conquistadors, for example, is no longer tolerable. So in that way, I think what they obscure and what they can reveal changes over time, and it changes based on the context as well.
If at any point we come to an inflection moment where we decide that the morality has changed, the emphasis that we had placed in the past on specific areas was wrong and mislaid, then we have a problem where the monument becomes out of time, out of step, out of morality. And that is what we always have to deal with. So for me, the big question is always, when I look at a statue or any kind of monument, is its relevance to today. And because the history that it carries and the history that it embodies might be one that we might no longer be proud of. It might no longer be what we want to carry forward. It might no longer be what we want to teach our kids. And we see this, for example, in much of the discussion over Confederate statues and monuments and stuff and things like that, and whether we should continue to venerate them. And my feeling is that we should not, and that we should not in the first place have done it.
Sometimes these statues stand as a litmus test for the values of the people that live in the town. And aside from the values of the people who live in the town, it's the values of the people who are in power in that space. So it's a lot about control, I think, if something is still standing or if something has been taken down. And it's like always an active thing. Like, you cannot be neutral in this situation, because if you're neutral in this situation, you're like actually saying that something should still be standing. So I think that the reveal is the kind of like, if something is still standing, it's revealed that the powers that be want the narrative that the monument represents to stand.
Like, I always think about that quote of Robert Musil in 1936, where he's like, you know, there's nothing in the world as invisible as a monument. Wait, I have it here. There's nothing in the world as invisible as a monument. Like a drop of water on an oilskin, attention runs down them without stopping for a moment. And I was thinking, that to me, that is so depressing, but we kind of created that with the spectacle. But then I always go back to James E. Young, who talked about the best minds are the ones when they're in perpetual resolution, because history is not a period of end of sentence. It's history is constantly being revealed. History is fragmented in the way it's revealed to us. There's innumerable histories that are hidden. So in a way, if this object could be a thing that's malleable, that we're kind of in conversation with, and I always go back to the talking statues of the 16th century. And when I discovered them, I was like, oh my God, among all the mess happening in Rome at the time, but the idea of these 8 statues that became the spokesman for the people, people wrote notes on them. So all of a sudden there was a recognition that these statues were not supposed to be static. They were actually supposed to be engaged. So people writing notes to critique the government and the religious authority of the time. And then so the idea that these monuments can have shifting authors. So there's shifting authors, and that's the other thing about monuments and memorials and even public art in general. There's something where the author, the maker of the work, should fall away, because we're saying this is for the people.